Welcome back to the show. I'm Matthew Leffler. Thank you for joining us for another installment of this thing we keep doing. Look, I love the industry of transportation and supply chain, but there's a lot of stuff going on right now. I just got back from the Technology Maintenance Council, the American Trucking Associations. I talked about a little bit last week with our guest, Brandon Weissman. Brandon is the founder and CEO of a company called TruckSafe. It's a consulting firm that helps motor carriers deal with all of the regulatory compliance that comes along with moving things across the country. And there's a lot of changes that are in the works. So many changes. But the problems, they're not new. No, the problems are the same problems that we've experienced since the very beginning of hauling freight for money. At the end of the day, safely delivering freight on time and undamaged is difficult even under the best circumstances. And yet, the regulations don't stop. They just morph into new things to worry about, to deal with. Now, before I get my very special guest joining us, Ken Adamo, Chief of Analytics for DAT. Oh, we do love our friends at DAT, don't we? As I love to say, I deeply admire what the folks at DAT have been doing since 1978, helping truckers find loads, helping truckers get home. That's a Herculean task, again, even under the best circumstances. And we are so grateful for their partnership of working with us as we continue to try to find ways to educate and entertain you on all the nuances that come along with transportation. If you haven't checked out the podcast with Brandon, you really need to do that. I'll make sure to share that later this afternoon. This conversation with Ken is something we kind of put together over the last few weeks as we're trying to figure out, what are we looking to actually regulate? What do people really want to see? What do people think the business needs? And I have my thoughts. Ken has some of his, and we're going to dive into those things in just a few minutes. But I want to start off with the regs we know are happening. The regs we know are coming down. One of them is speed regulators. The idea that you as a truck driver are going to have to move at a certain speed, even if that's not the speed you feel safely comfortable traveling. See, every single state in the country has a speed limit, every single one of them. They've always had speed limits in most states. And what's gone down recently is the idea that every truck should be governed at a certain speed. Now, there's a ton of value for going slower. Oh, the value is easy to tell. One, fuel economy. That's a big way to save money, is going slower. It also reduces your wear on tires, and it reduces your maintenance costs overall by going slower. And it does, for the most part, impact your insurance rates. The slower your truck, and if it's governed, you actually can get a lower rate. But fundamentally, the speed by which we travel as a professional driver is kind of up to us. How do you pass somebody when you're only going 1 mile an hour faster? So one of the big values of transportation is the ability to work with a bunch of different motor carriers. I've loved my experiences with motor carriers. The question becomes, who should know what speed we should go? Should that speed be done by the feds or up to the individual business owners and how they want to proceed with their business? The really important piece to keep in mind when you talk about speed regulation is, if you're paid by the mile, the slower you go, the less money you make. And that's a real concern that we have to understand about speed regulation. Now, when the FMCSA put out their very first notice around this, they had actually said 68 miles per hour. Now, that was redacted. They took that off. That number's not fixed anymore. But we will see something. And when that something comes down, there's going to be a period of time to comply with it. And how do you comply with speed regulation? Well, you have to reset your truck. Take it to a shop or a dealer, have them plug in and reset what actually allows the truck to go a certain speed. A lot more to come on this. This is a very controversial topic, as you can no doubt appreciate. But there's so many more. Broker transparency, minimum rate requirements. Oh, the insurance behind all of it. The last thing I'll mention before I bring in my good friend Ken is this bill that's currently in Congress. This is the interestingly named Fair Compensation for Truck Crash Victims Act. Now, as of 1980, the minimum insurance required for an interstate carrier for just general dry goods is $750,000. $750,000. Now, that doesn't really understand or appreciate the rise in medical costs, the rise in jury verdicts, and that's why insurance remains one of the top 5 or 6 biggest costs for a trucking company. I have little doubt that the increase of insurance through that bill will not happen. It does not have the support of most of the people in the Congress, and I just don't think it's a regulation that our industry right now can deal with. I mean, you have to imagine how expensive it is to have insurance today with a minimum of $750,000 and 5xing that. That is an incredible change. I do like when people have adequate insurance for the risk that they're actually bringing to the world. But again, this is a thing that's going to be happening, and we're going to be dealing with this for many, many years. They've tried to raise this before. They haven't been successful. Will they be successful this time? I doubt it. Now, the very last thing I'm going to share, and this is cool. You're going to love this. Mark your calendars, folks. May 9th, 2024. It's a Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're having a panel discussion. I'm going to be moderating a call with Dave Broering from NFI, Jason Miller from Michigan State University, Eli Broad College of Business, and Benjamin Gordon. We love Ben, Cambridge Capital investor extraordinaire. We're going to talk about what will it look like when things get better. What are the telltale signs to think about a recovery in the freight market? This is, without a doubt, the worst freight market we've seen since 2008. Capacity continues to exit the business, but ultimately, there's still a lot of capacity to leave, and consumers don't necessarily have the money to be buying a bunch of stuff. They bought their patio furniture a couple years ago, probably not looking to replace the patio furniture anytime soon. So with all that being said, I'm so excited to have Ken. DAT, Dial a Truck. DAT, fantastic business. Let's talk with our good friend, Ken Adamo. Ken, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Leffler.
How are you doing?
How are you?
I'm living La Vida Loca, man. How have you been? This has been an interesting week, I think.
I'm tired, boss.
What is going on? Like, this is why I'm so excited to have you. I've been seeing a lot on the internet, but what is happening at DAT right now?
Yeah, so I, first and foremost, apologize to our customers. We've been having some issues on our network side. It's been causing some outages. So rest assured, our engineering teams, led, right in the trenches by our exec team, is in there in the trenches with these folks day and night. So getting on some stable footing. And again, these type of things are marathons, not sprints. You mentioned we're a legacy company that's been there for a long time, helping folks find capacity and find loads. And with that comes much as I'm finding that father time is undefeated in my body when I play basketball 3 days a week. Shout out to the Buckeyes that play at 6:30 tonight against Illinois. You need to keep up with that maintenance, right? Take that, what's it called, that glucosamine and all of my joint health supplements so I can stumble up and down the court. There's a probably tortured analogy there as it pertains to tech debt that we're paying down.
I see. I heard there was rumors of like an attack on the website. Is that anything around that being accurate?
That's one of those things where I'm not in that loop, to be honest with you. I think best practices at any company, I'm not speaking specific to DAT, or that the audience that would be privy to that is incredibly small, even at the executive level. Mm-hmm. Those folks would focus on that if that were the case. I just know that we've had service interruptions. I've been talking with customers, trying to get them what they need in the meantime, and hearing their feedback.
Yeah, well, I appreciate
looking at all the memes on the internet, which folks love to poke people when they're down, but yeah, it's been tough.
I can understand the frustration. Technology is never fun. At least from my experience, it's a tool to get the business done. And when you have an interruption, it makes things frustrating. But I appreciate you coming on and talking about this. Now, we had set this up initially to talk about regulations, like getting into the weeds about what people think should happen. And I like to use this number is like, what is the actual cost to operate a commercial vehicle? And it varies for a lot of reasons based on what route you have, what speed you travel, all this. But I think it's fair to say it's over $2 a mile to operate a truck when it comes to the fuel and all the other pieces. But the rates are really, really not there. So what is happening in the world of people moving freight right now? What are you seeing out there?
So there's kind of like a cruel economic underpinning here, which I've tried to get into, and I know Twitter's not the best medium for this. I've tried, but So you have to look at like short run and long run economics. Over the short run, unfortunately, right, and I'm going to caveat that as such, the rate to which truckload prices will fall kind of asymptotes out or reaches the short-term variable cost to operate a truck. So think of like the direct expenses as you're rolling down the road. And it's not like extremely direct. Like I would consider like your monthly truck payment and any like your very short-term expenses. Yeah. And so the problem with that is you obviously have expenses that aren't just variable. And so when you have a maintenance issue come up, you have a breakdown, you get a speeding ticket, your annual or semi-annual or quarterly insurance payment comes due, the market isn't supporting that short term. Now, over the long arc of time, the market has a floor that is basically the total all-in operating cost, right?
That's right.
But over the short term, the market becomes what I would call oversold. So it blows past that. And that's why you see kind of real sporadic and spiky market exits. If you look at like when people generally might be on a quarterly insurance schedule, at the end of those quarters, you'll see a spike in carrier attrition when the market's bad because they were running by the skin of their teeth. And then
they have been in the last year or so. Absolutely.
Yeah.
To kind of build off your points, like the costs of trucking are very easily to know. Like the number one expense for most motor carriers is fuel. That is the lion's share of their spend. Labor comes second. The assets, the truck and the trailer, they come third. Maintenance and repair is usually fourth. And then fifth and sixth is going to be either tires or insurance. And that varies for a lot of reasons, but those are the other expenses. And then you have like your softwares, your TMSs, all this. But like the real expenses are really easy to kind of identify. My concern as a lawyer, and I am a lawyer, let me be very clear on this, is that we have assets that are on the road every single day that are not DOT compliant. Like they are not safe. And what we find when people are in tough times is they start to defer maintenance. That's the first place they say, "Oh, we'll extend the PM for another 60 days. We'll do it then, and we'll wait on those repairs until it actually breaks down, as opposed to doing it preventatively." Does that concern you that we have roughly 20% of all commercial vehicles like not compliant with the underlying DOT regulations?
I think it's extremely concerning, and I know that much like petty crime and other things, it increases when conditions are bad, right? Like when the economy is doing poorly, you see an increase in thefts and robberies and all that kind of thing. I just don't know that number is meaningfully different when rates are at cycle highs.
You're also right. You're absolutely correct.
Yeah, it's like I think the fundamental problem is I don't know if it's education and I don't know if it's regulation. I don't know by what mechanism we get. I think a lot of this boils down to the government agency, the tax-funded government agency in charge of enforcing a lot of these safety regulations is very, very bad at enforcing these safety regulations. Right? What's the percentage of carriers out there with a safety score right now? It's less than 40%, right?
That's right. Well, that's a good point you bring up, is like, I like to look at it's a feature of our system, not a bug of the system. After deregulation, like before dereg, it was like 16,000 motor carriers. Like it was nothing. Today it's hundreds of thousands, if not more than that. And the challenge becomes you can just get a CDL in under a month, maybe 2 months tops to get a CDL. You can get a lease agreement from some company and get access to a piece of equipment. And then you're moving 80,000 pounds of machinery.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting thought. So people on the internet have been saying, well, shouldn't we just mandate that the rate that the driver can receive be above their operating cost? Like, and that some people are like, yeah, maybe that should be an interesting thing. I don't think more regulation's the answer, but what is your response to someone who says like, hey, we should make it that at a minimum, a shipper needs to pay the cost of maintaining and operating a commercial vehicle?
You can't have it both ways. I mean, and I've been outspoken on this. The very idea of that is so absurd that I find it difficult that it's rooted in a genuine call to action for that specific thing, right? The market can't be at both times deregulated and regulated around price controls.
Yeah, exactly.
It fundamentally cannot be, right? Because you have at its core, there's a list. You mentioned the maintenance and all the trucking issues. There's a list of reasons why trucking rates are variable by geography, by time of year, by in and outbound. And fundamentally, if you look at a spot like Florida, South Florida, there's far more trucks coming in than there's freight coming out. So unless you're going to fundamentally reform and put in capital cost recapture measures, which is what regulation fundamentally is, there's no people aren't going to all of a sudden build factories in Southern Florida to minimize their supply chain cost and maximize their supply chain efficiency. It just doesn't work like that. You can't have, these are antithetical philosophies, right? I think we could have a legitimate argument about whether trucking should go back to being a regulated, there's a lot of really good arguments.
Yeah.
Like that's the funny 100%. Thing. Like I disagree with them, but I think if someone came honestly and earnestly and said, look, here's 10 reasons why I think trucking should be regulated like the power industry, something that I came from, the electricity industry. Because a lot of states and a lot of transmission networks realized that, look, regulation isn't good in our part of the country or for us. So they went back and re-regulated. It's not good for the consumer, perhaps. I think that's a better argument than we should put in quasi price floors based on actually operating costs.
Yeah. I mean, this is, there's a comment I'm going to share here. It's from Data 2 Roadsides. It basically, he says the system is broken and too much of the costs are shifted to the motor carriers. And I want to just build off of that a little bit, because I tend to agree with that. So before deregulation, average truck driver made about $38,000 a year. You adjust that for inflation, it's about 110, 120. So it's a really interesting time when you could put a kid through school, buy a house, buy a car as a truck driver. Today, fast forward, and the average comp for a truck driver is like $50,000 after all the expenses are taken out. And that was the point of deregulation. The goal that Carter announced when he signed that right into law was that it would save $8 billion a year, $8 billion with a B a year. And that largely came off of the motor carrier. It became a thing for them where they were the ones who had to absorb that cost savings. And for better or for worse, that's the supply chain we find ourselves in. And as you kind of outlined this idea of, a price floor being maybe not the greatest solution, I think there are regulations that could be put in place that maybe would solve at least some of the problems. I like to think of things like forcing any owner operator with authority to have a maintenance escrow account. So they're taking part of their money and throwing in. Some do this now, but it's not required. Yeah. So that's the thing. And then I also could imagine like maybe FMCSA requiring 2 inspections a year versus just the 1. So you touch the asset more often. I just use this example because I think it's really important. The Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance is going to have International Road Check, I believe, May 14th through 16th. It's somewhere in that range. And every single year, like you mentioned, it's always 20%. Good times and bad times. It's always 20% of the vehicles fail. And it's like, is that what we want? Is that the idea that we want to see? I just don't know. What do you think about some of that I just threw out there?
I think the best small fleet and owner operators, who kind of demographically make up, if you could build the ideal, we could rebuild him. We have the technology.
Yeah, exactly.
The absolute best possible circumstances for which you'd have a successful owner operator. You know what they'd be? Ex-military, got their CDL in the military. They come out after doing generally 2 deployments. They're religiously disciplined. They know that miles matter. They keep track of everything. There's a kicker there if you could get a husband and a wife in a truck and run a team. Yeah. Right. So the wheels are always rolling. So I think just like all trucks aren't unsafe, all trucks aren't unprofitable right now. There are hundreds of thousands of motor carriers working in the spot market right now that are. I'm not making a case that it's not really, really tough right now. I'm just making a case that like the edges of any distribution are always the noisiest. I don't care what you're studying, right? Dune 2 reviews. Most people love that movie. Sure, there's some people that really, really, really love it and think it's the best, put it up there against The Godfather. There's some people that think it's the worst movie ever made and Denis Villeneuve should never produce another movie again. I think like that's what we see is like during great times on the carrier side, those edges become moot, right? They just don't really matter. Right now they encroach on. And the problem is this is a massive hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue industry. So those edges get noisy and they should, right? There's a lot, through the noise, there's a lot of people on social media at trade shows and other venues that are arguing for really, really great change. Yeah. And I think there is a ton more we can do. I'm not anti-regulation. Like I want to know that the pill I'm putting in my mouth isn't going to kill me.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
I don't think those prices for those pills should be regulated by and large. I think there's special circumstances. Like I think it's helpful to have a nuanced view, especially one that you're putting forward on regulation, in that there can be a gap between full-on re-regulation and, hey, 80,000 pounds of steel and diesel should not be driving down the highway waiting to explode at any minute.
Yeah, there's a comment I want to share because I think we can build off of this. This is from Adam. He says, if we go back to a regulated market, who gets to keep their authority? Many people pushing this narrative are mostly single truck operators or small fleets at best. And I would say this, and if I had a magic wand to make something different, I would want to see the insurance rates higher for everyone. I think it's absurd that it's still at $750,000. I would want to see additional vehicle inspections, and I would want to see more significant penalties for critical out of service. And who survives in that market are the ones that can absorb that cost. I think we let the market kind of ebb and flow with motor carriers going bankrupt because they've basically ran out of enough rope to keep moving, or they lost a credit line that they had, or they lost a significant customer. And while I do like the fact that people are able to win and lose in a market, I would just like it to be the barrier to enter the business being more significant. Same to an extent with the brokers, but brokers they're not really in the safety space necessarily. They're more in the matchmaking space.
Yeah, I think, look, I don't know a lot about many things, but I'm here to tell you, trust someone else if you don't trust me. The type of regulation that's being discussed, this broad scale regulation, will be wholesale across the board, insanely negative for small carriers.
Oh, absolutely.
That cannot be understated, right? The companies that will pull through a re-regulated environment will be the ones with substantial capital bases, large fleets of rolling assets, the capital and the lines of credit needed to implement some of these things and then eventually benefit from the things being talked about. So my fear is you've got some loud folks who either do know and have ulterior motives or are just ignorant to like the broad economic applications of this. And they'll be the dog that caught the car. So this is never going to happen. We're never repealing the MCA. Never going to happen. If it does, I'll wear a Michigan hat for 1 year straight.
I think Jason would appreciate that. I think we'd all appreciate it.
Yeah.
Maybe Michigan State. I think that would be okay with me.
No, I would actually go as far as to wear Michigan. I might wear a Michigan State pullover. So that's not going to happen. But let's say if it did, there's this great paradox, like the dog that caught the car. Dogs love to chase cars, right?
That's the narrative I've heard. I've never seen it happen.
What are they going to do if they catch it? What are you going to do? So like, wouldn't that be something? Like we get re-regulated, we have price floors, and then essentially the owner operator is wiped from the face of the industry for good.
Yeah.
Because that's what will happen. How many motor carriers were there before you had a great stat.
It was like 16,000. I mean, it was nothing before deregulation. It was, you had lanes that were prioritized. You couldn't actually grow your business except for mergers and acquisitions. Like it was designed to be like a utility. It's very similar to thinking about how we think of cable companies or we think about power companies. They are heavily regulated back in those days.
Yeah, I think I was called a 5 foot tall, 100-pound pencil protector. I'm actually 6'4", 220, but I lived through deregulation of electricity, and it's fascinating the impact on the consumer and the impact on the businesses, and the law of unintended consequences that happened as each of these regions opened up. And look at Texas, right? Do we all forget just a couple of years ago? ERCOT, the grid operator in Texas, decided to have a closed network.
Yep.
In the spirit of Texas froze over. They had no power.
Yeah, that's right.
These things have consequences.
It's an interesting analogy too, as you mentioned Texas, because like the thing on my mind, whenever I think about Texas right now, I think about the pending case in Werner Enterprises. And this case is, I emphatically tell every motor carrier, every broker, and any shipper that has brokerage capabilities or brokerage functionality that they do internally, they need to understand that case. I mean, at the core of that case is the idea that a driver who did nothing illegal and never did anything that was, unsafe. They were going under the speed limit, and another vehicle lost control, crossed 10 yards of median, and collided with that truck. And Werner got hit with right now over $130 million verdict. No small carrier can absorb that ever. And if you still have the ability for brokers to potentially be responsible, a broker could also be tagged into that. And that has to do with like F4A preemption and other things. But it's a fascinating case that will absolutely impact every single thing that gets moved, because insurers are going to have to figure out, how do I deal with this new risk? This idea that my client could do nothing wrong and then end up being hit with an astronomical verdict. Have you paid much attention to that case at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of big things, mainly through your reporting and podcasts. I've been keep paying attention to this. But again, where does that shift the market? I think that's what we all need to be paying attention to. Is like, does that shift the market towards or away from brokerages versus shipper direct? Does it shift the market to or from large asset-based carriers versus small carriers? This one seems to be putting small carriers and brokerages on fairly shaky ground, or at least uncertain ground as it pertains to the legal implications.
Absolutely. I think when you look at so the Supreme Court of the United States has twice now been asked to weigh in on what we call F4A preemption, the idea that a broker can be responsible for the negligence of a motor carrier. And we have two different cases. One was Miller v. C.H. Robinson. That case found that C.H. Robinson could potentially be liable for it. And then we had the Global Trans VE case, and that was found to say, no, exact opposite. Broker can't be held responsible. So if you're a broker and you are not following these cases about like the types of verdicts that are available and the types of people or entities that can be sued, you are missing the boat, because SCOTUS is not going to take a case on like that unless we have more circuits conflicting. And that liability is going to drive rates up for everybody. Every single motor carrier will be hit by this. And it kind of goes back to this idea we talked about before. If the motor carrier can't actually insure the risk that they pose to the motoring public, because it's $750,000, do we need regulations to change that? And I don't know the answer. I feel like we need more insurance, but I'm a lawyer. I like when my client has the money to pay for what I do.
Yeah. And this is where I think these conversations actually get nuanced and productive, right? Because if I'm a carrier and I'm not just out there screaming on a street corner, I think, well, maybe the broker should bear a higher percentage of that. Maybe they should be forced to set up more than a $75,000 bond. Maybe they should be forced to carry, I don't know, liability insurance.
Yeah, there's a lot of brokers who don't carry liability. Many of the big ones absolutely do, because they've been down this road before. But the smaller ones that just pop up, they have no idea. They have no idea the kind of risk that's involved with transporting things all across the U.S.
Yeah. So this is, I think, where the conversation actually gets interesting and productive, is when we start to talk about shared, like what percentage of the liability should be shared across the supply chain.
Yeah, because what happens
how should that
ultimately,
risk be insured?
I remember vividly in a case I did many, many, many years ago. A motor carrier got found liable for like $800,000, something like that. And the motor carrier was paid. Basically, the insurance company paid their maximum. They said, okay, we're going to take the entire policy, $750,000. Here you go. We're tendering it over to you. And the motor carrier came back. I was like, well, what happens now? Like, there's still this $50,000 gap. Like, well, you're going to pay for that. They're going to lien your truck. They're going to lien your house. They're going to lien your bank accounts. They'll get the money. They're going to get the money. And that carrier ended up going bankrupt. And that's what happens in our business is you get hit, you go bankrupt, you come back a year later as another MC, another motor carrier, and you're back to the same business. And that's like again, it's a feature of our supply chain, not a bug. And this is how it's kind of designed to allow smaller fragmented pieces of the business to continue to operate. Because the problem is us, the American consumer. We need things faster and cheaper. Like, there's no place for us to afford more expensive solutions. I find this so fascinating because it just informs every aspect of what we're doing in the supply chain. Because at the end of the day, what is the cost to actually operate a truck? Beyond all of the ancillary things of, your fuel and your maintenance, and everything, what is the risk you pose to society? Because at the end of the day, it's society that's going to subsidize any missing piece, whether it's through Social Security or Medicaid or whatever else is out there. So I don't know. I think our industry doesn't talk enough about this holistic approach of who bears the risk. We all look at who's delivering for the cheapest amount, the fastest, and it's the world we live in.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I push because I want carriers, small carriers specifically, to be armed with more tools. That I continue to be baffled at the level of reticence to accept tools, advice, different lines of thinking. Right? The tools are available universally across all sides of the supply chain, but they are used in a massively disproportioned way. Right? And take us out of the equation. This isn't even me being a homer. Like, the companies that are leveraging market insights about what it costs to move freight are balanced 95% to brokers in a broker carrier transaction, right?
Yeah.
They know far more about the market, where the freight's flowing, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if we can make some big strides as an industry to get carriers equipped to more effectively negotiate, I think that would raise the bar. Because I think it's not a perfectly efficient market. That's a fallacy. I think that's what gets lost in some of this discourse, is that I don't think it's a perfectly efficient market. I think it's probably imbalanced towards the larger players. And I think a lot of companies that are out there, present company included, that are trying to extend technology and tools that big companies have to small are facing opposition that's perplexing.
Yeah,
right.
I absolutely. I think you're right on the money. Is like this industry, even the best in the world, like your Knight Swifts and your Werners and your Schneiders, are getting crushed. Like Q4 was brutal for so many of the truckload carriers. The LTLs tend to be a little bit more, I'd say, resilient, and their networks are still very challenging to balance in any condition. But when the best in the world are struggling to be profitable, you have to imagine how many of the small people are barely hanging on to solvency. One bad breakdown but for that, they go bankrupt. And I just think, like, is this really the supply chain we want? And I go back and I think, well, if it's not, what is the alternative? And I don't think you ever get to a place where there's more regulation, like how much minimum rates people have, or how much margin a broker can legally charge. Like, I talk about this quite a bit. Like, brokers aren't making 40% on average. Like, that's not the world we live in.
No, they're making 65%, Leffler. What are you talking about?
That's right. I forget about this. Like, the brokers are all driving, beautiful vehicles. They have wonderful mansions, and they're all doing incredibly well right now.
It's unfortunate, and this isn't directed at any one person, right? It's just that it's a shame that there's a pattern that is just as old as I've been in the industry, that the folks that contingent of the industry takes advice from are the worst possible folks to take advice from. Right? Like a 2-minute Google search, you're like, I mean, knock on wood, because I do like to drive fast, I've never even had a speeding ticket, right? Like,
good for you.
So it's like, I certainly haven't had to pay millions of dollars to federal agencies based on fraudulent schemes. I haven't had to do any of that. So I don't know, if you weigh the probability that Leffler and Adamo are in some collusive cabal with the brokerage industry to garner 65% margins.
That's right.
I drive an F-150 pickup truck. I don't have a G-Wagon in my driveway.
Yeah.
It's like, there just needs to be there's a common thread that's not here, that's in a lot of these industries that have figured this out, and it's transparency.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right.
There's a couple of things we'll never figure out, because a lot of industries that do have these cyclical, volatile markets, they have the ability to store. So, if you think about oil, I know there's a carrying cost of storage, but that is an industry where wells can be paused and abandoned, and the actual commodity in question can be stored.
Yeah,
you can't store trucking capacity.
And that's a really good point you bring up, because this is not an aberration. Like, the market has always been feast or famine. It has never been anything but that. There's never this, it's always good, it's always consistent. Maybe there's some level of contract freight that can be kind of identified as perpetual. But the motor carriers that survive, that have lived as long as they have, are able to flex capacity, lay off drivers, park equipment, and they can bring them back when the market gets better. But this is something that a lot of newer entrances to the business don't understand. Like, you have to, when it's good times, save as much money as you can, because it will not be that way. And if you're looking at the flatbed market, that is the indicator for home construction. If that's not doing well, everything else kind of follows along that same path. So what are some of the things as an industry people, what are the signs we should look for that would indicate rates or a market getting more improved, at least from the carrier side? I know for shippers, they love this period of time. I'm more of a motor carrier guy, so I'm more concerned about their solvency.
Yeah, so I think there's no winners in arguing what's the worst market cycle in recent memory. So I'm just going to caveat that as such. I'm about to tiptoe into an argument that has no benefit, but I'm going to go there anyway. I don't think this is the worst freight market since 2008. I lived through that 15-16 industrial slowdown, and that's when essentially the big three got kicked in the teeth. That's when you saw this massive proliferation of foreign automakers moving into the Southeast with massive tax abatements from Mississippi, Southern Tennessee, Alabama, all of that,
That
which
worked
just
great
kind
for
of
Boeing
rocked.
too, didn't it?
It just kind of like rocked the world of what was going on there. And I get like there were less media outlets to pay attention to. I'm not saying that that isn't a barb, by the way. I'm just to be clear. I know people assume I'm snarky all the time. That's not a barb. It's just I'm thankful there's more media now, right? I'm thankful that. But I'm saying I think it was probably less talked about, but it was probably harder on the people directly in the industry. Look, 2019 rolling into 2020 was like awful. Like that was my last full year in the industry. You know, the second year FedEx suspended all employee bonuses and they were completely retooling everything, and senior executives were getting left and right walked out the door, and then protesting in front of the White House, if you remember, like an actual convoy showed up in front of the White House in May of 2020 due to the shutdown. So like I think like the bottoms have a recency bias and they're never comfortable, right? They're never fun. They're never comfortable. So I think the signs we look for have enough. The only way we're going to dig out of this, from my perspective, in this particular instance, is enough carriers to trick the market that we reach equilibrium and start to go back up. I think we're probably about there.
Oh,
I don't think that's I don't think that's really like a hot take either. We track interstate for hire motor carrier authorities. We've lost about 35 to 37,000. We might have a couple thousand more to go. Signs are pointing that we're in equilibrium. I think this produce and spring shipping season will be a tailwind. Excuse me, a tailwind. Probably a slow summer. It's always slow between the 4th of July and back to school. And then this fall is when we start to see recovery in earnest. So I think that is a pretty consensus, pretty vanilla view. I think everyone got a pretty big head fake in January when things were really, really cold, and Christmas basically lasted until the end of January, and then they got snapped back to reality. So that's what I look at to say the rates can't really go any lower, right? If they do, you're just going to have a massive blob of attrition, which will bring the recovery faster.
I see. Would you think that we'll still see significant attrition for the next 2-3 months, 4 months, or you think we're going to be starting to see that balance you were talking about? Because my feeling is, I think we're going to continue to see, a lot of motor carriers leaving up through probably Q3, and then I hope a Q4 or maybe a Q1 of 25 where things get more normalized, where you can cover your operational costs.
I mean, I think if that happens, then I change my tune, and it is the worst in the last decade and a half. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the numbers are already trending in the right direction. Believe it or not, like even though February was pretty terrible, fuel wasn't as big of a deal, and they had some money in their pocket from January, so we saw attritions not as strong. And February is not overly terrible. You got to realize too, right? Like a lot of the capacity has exited, right? Yeah, it's standing to be a really good produce season absent Southern California. We had Cody Kaler on earlier this week. He's produce savant in the industry to talk about that. So I think when you look at it, we're standing as we sit here right now, halfway through March, only attriting negative 1,000 carriers, for hire interstate authorities. That's probably get trending back towards where we need to be. It all depends on where rates go. Tail half of this month. April and May are make or break months in any recovery. Like if you go back and look at the last 15 years, April, May are crucially important.
Yeah.
And then, that will tee up what the end of Q2 and Q3 look like.
I think one of the challenges we have is like what made COVID, then that boom last for so long, was all this money getting put into the hands of American consumers. And then they were stuck at home. So they're spending money on all sorts of things. And now there's no government money coming through. You have student loans are back. Interest rates are still not terrific. And I just see that for a consumer, you're spending more money for the same stuff. And I just don't see a path where it gets to a place where it moves to a recovery faster than that. And I hope that I'm wrong. I think if you are correct, that makes me a lot happier, because then I can lease people trailers, which would be terrific. But if we still see this prolonged, downward cycle and more people exiting, it's going to be interesting. I am very curious to get your thoughts on the brokers that are out there, because I have great general visibility into what motor carriers are experiencing. How are brokers doing right now? Are they still making money, or are they in the same kind of predicament that the motor carriers are in?
This is the worst part of the cycle. If you divvy the cycle up into 4 quadrants, right, which is pretty easy to do if you look at the coyote curve that Chris Pickett popularized, it's pretty easy to see 4 quadrants in there. We're in the worst. We're at the nadir of the worst quadrant for brokers. And why is that? Well, spot rates are really, really low. Volumes are low. And then contracts that any broker that has any sort of contract rate is likely rebidding that at the same or lower rates,
Right.
most likely lower. And that's against higher operating costs. They just gave their employees their annual merit increases, most likely their rent and insurance probably went up, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the point where their margins are just getting absolutely crushed.
So
right?
it's more like 30% margin than the normal 60% margin.
You have to get the lower trim G-Wagon, actually.
That's a
you have to
sacrifice
special
that a
order
broker
from
shouldn't have to
Mercedes.
make. It's not fair.
They don't let you pick it up out front. You have to pick it up in the back so they don't see you driving the poor person G-Wagon. But that's where brokerages are. So you're seeing brokerage attrition. You're seeing the big publicly traded brokers. They all have targets on their back.
Yeah.
People are just feasting on C.H. Robinson's. And look, C.H. Robinson is like reinventing themselves, right? They've brought pretty much an entire new exec staff in. They're trying to balance their tech spend, right? Like investing $1 billion in technology when rates were $4 a mile and everyone was happy is a great idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's probably not so great right now. Think about like return to office. Like it's all the things, even like the non-transportation. Like imagine like you've been to brokerage offices, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Like how many ping pong tables are getting like sold on Facebook Marketplace because no one's there? Like the unused square footage, and they're like, "Hey, I'm going to force you to come back in the office." It's like I'm going to go work at Wendy's and make the same amount of money right now.
That's a good point. I mean, that's the piece of like the back to the office thing is really interesting because we kind of before COVID. Nobody thought you could work remote. The workers clearly all thought we could do it remotely, but the reality was the ownership team was like, I need to see you. I need to make sure you're doing what I need you to do. And once COVID happened, we showed that you could work productively remotely. And actually, I saw there was a lot of added productivity in general for working from home because people were just available more. And now this push to return to the office, I think it's going to be another one of these really interesting things on a commercial real estate bubble or something to that effect. I don't know, man. The future outside of freight and trucking is still very uncertain given everything else we see happening.
Yeah. So look, I mean, I work in software right now that serves the trucking industry. I can tell you there's a collaboration tax that happens with full remote work. So we try to get our folks at least every couple months in person to really, as a freight broker, I'm sorry, but like I love golf. I belong to a golf club. I love to play golf. I don't think like there's no correlation between the number of golf simulators you have in your office to the number of loads you're brokering. I promise you that correlation does not exist. It just doesn't, right? So
That's
like,
right.
You know, when you're in a city like Chicago and you're competing for these, like what is the archetypal freight brokerage hire? It's like Division I school. Honestly, if they played any kind of organized sport at any point at a higher level, they're usually like highly predictive of success in brokerage, believe it or not. That's why when you go to most brokerages, you have the football helmets from all the schools around the perimeter. So you hire these people, they're making 50 grand on stipend, and then they go on full commission. That's not something you need to be in an office for, right? And in fact, round the clock coverage in this day and age of round the clock coverage, I think there are, this is an interesting question to throw back at you. I lived through when they changed they raised the minimum to be considered, and they changed some of the commission rules to be a exempt versus non-exempt employee.
Absolutely.
That becomes tricky with work from home. And I know that greatly impacted the brokerage industry. So maybe that's a wrinkle that I don't have eyeballs on, but by and large.
To build off of that, so for the folks listening, we'll talk about the TQL case is the one that's most in our minds right now. That case, and I don't have the exact numbers. I think it was like 4,500 employees came in as what we would say they're exempt from overtime. They were essentially said they're kind of management or they're something to that effect, but they were mostly trainees, and the trainees were paid between $30,000 and maybe $38,000, and they were working 60 hours a week. And what ends up happening is someone sues, they get it certified as a class action in Ohio. And that litigation lasted for 13 years. 13 years they fought this, because when you misclassify someone, when you tell them you are exempt as opposed to non-exempt, or whatever the case may be, and you're found to have misclassified, there's all these penalties you have to deal with in back wages and overtime. And you get to a place where you don't insure those things. No insurance company in the world will insure you for violating wage and hour. They just won't do it. And that liability that TQL faced was anywhere from $100 million to $200 million. And the fact of the matter is, to your point earlier, every broker, for the most part, follows that model where they say you're a trainee, you're going to get salary, and then you're going to work crazy amounts of hours. And then eventually you get to graduate to being a full broker or whatever they call it. And now you're going to get straight commission. And it's that time between salary and commission where you're in this very delicate balance of, did you classify correctly? And one of the ways that brokerages have solved this or helped address it is they do have them clock in and clock out like they would for a normal hourly person.
Yep. That's exactly
or
what
they
you do.
send it
or
across.
You pay them the minimum.
Yeah, exactly. And then they send them across the world. And they have people in India or Pakistan, Eastern Europe or South America that are doing the same activities, but they're not having the same wage and hour compliance that we have in the United States. What do you think about the offshoring of that kind of labor in the brokerage industry?
I mean, I know dozens of, there's more than dozens, but I have like intimate knowledge and experience with dozens of major brokerages that have had tremendous success with nearshoring in Central and South America.
Yeah.
I think that is something that just universally, if it works in your business model, I think you need to go in eyes wide open that it isn't a hands-off thing, right? You see a lot of my colleagues and friends, frankly, in the industry, making a lot of round trips to Colombia, which isn't the worst thing in the world.
Yeah.
Tie that into a little family vacation, but you're hands-on, right? We started doing some of it with our call center ops, and it's just terrific.
Absolutely. It's been going on with software development forever and just general call centers.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's great. Like English is a first language in a lot of cases down. Like there's a whole generation of folks that were even brought up speaking English as a first or at least a co-first language. So it's there's no time zone difference. So I think it's really been beneficial. I think on the dev shop side, you continue, like that's a broader thing that I'm not super qualified. We have an India operation at DAT, some of the best capabilities that we're able to fund on round the clock service and support, right? So if you have like tier 1 or tier 2 support, if you have, that is much more mature and known. I don't have as much experience with like the Eastern European dispatch cohort.
Well, I look at this and we started off on the brokerage, offshoring and nearshoring. We never got to that with drivers. So like the driver situation had been, after deregulation, was we're going to make everybody independent contractors and we're going to have them be business owners and have this whole story about this. And I look at it and go, well, like the greatest innovations in transportation, in my opinion, were containerization. Like that was really important. And then the advent of the owner operator. Those are the two, I think, biggest innovations we've seen in trucking. And the next phase is another regulation that is coming along faster than many think, and that's automation. And so right now, the FMCSA, which is the regulatory body that governs safety in our business, has this advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, which is a legal term that says like, hey, industry, we're thinking of doing something. What do you think? And that's around level 4 and level 5 automation. Level 4 is a remote operator. So a human being basically managing a drone, essentially. And the other one is the remote assistant, which is full autonomous. The human being doesn't intervene, but they share information. They help talk to law enforcement or whatever has to happen. And we saw an interesting thing last year, which was a bill in California. It was going to mandate a human being in every single autonomous truck. And OIDA was for this, and other people were for it. Teamsters were really important for them. And Newsom vetoed it. So we know California is not going to require, at least at this point, a human being in the car or the truck. And we also know that the regulator is looking at this. I see the world where DAT is just basically sending data to robots and the robots go and do the stuff. There are fleets today that are running autonomous trucks. They have a safety driver, but that's a matter of time before it changes. And it might not be like in Montana or Colorado or California, but it'll be in Texas or Kansas or Nebraska, relays essentially. What do you think about the autonomous trucking kind of piece that's coming down?
I mean, there's a lot. We've put a lot of money into trying to understand this problem through talking with industry folks, bringing in consultants. And I think fundamentally, like level 3 is arguably more dangerous, because imagine like half paying attention and only needing to snap to attention. Like there's a lot of studies out there that say like level 3, when you have kind of like a partially personed, by the way, it's supposed to be personed vehicle, there. I look, I think there's a lot of parallels between this is going to sound totally weird, but bear with me, between like intermodal and the future of autonomous vehicles, right? Because I think like,
absolutely, 100%.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think when you think about industry adoption currently, even at present, of intermodal and some of that reticence toward like the huge benefit of point-to-point truckload is there's no rails.
Mm-hmm.
You can go anywhere. It's unscheduled. It's pick and drop. I think the universe, at least in the near term, the term any of us should be worried about, is probably kind of largely boxed by things that can be mapped, planned, and routed. So it's probably going to have the biggest impact out of the gate. So in the next 10 years on private, dedicated, and like the tippy top of contract freight, the 5 loads a week, 400 miles, point to point, drop trailer, Bentonville, Arkansas to wherever 450 miles from Bentonville will be. I don't know. Gary, Indiana. I don't know. So I think that's probably, if you're worried about automation coming for your Friday afternoon, same day pickup, 45,000 pound out of Elk Grove going to San Diego for cross border.
I love Elk Grove.
You don't really have anything to worry about, I don't think. It's fascinating though. I think it's going to pull with it a lot of really great technology. I think they who own the technology will certainly own the future as it pertains to that. Because it's all about routing, it's all about density, it's all about that kind of thing. It's hard enough to plan density with the current internal combustion personed vehicle.
That's right.
Frankly.
I see, as you mentioned, the intermodal side. I would even go a little bit further because I think the type of truck that gets automated at scale first isn't going to be a day cab and it's not going to be a sleeper. I think the first truck that gets widely adopted will be spotting trucks, terminal tractors. These are generally trucks that are at warehouses, distribution centers, terminals. They may be at the ports moving chassis around, but the terminal tractor, the vast majority are off highway, meaning they're not regulated by the DOT. You don't need a driver's license to operate one of these trucks, though many people do, or a CDL, let alone a CDL. So those trucks are typically running 24/7 every day because they are moving boxes from the terminal or the warehouse to the yard at a specific spot in a finite place. And I feel that that is probably where the vast majority of early adoption will take place because it's on your own private land. You don't have to worry about it having some catastrophic failure and everyone seeing it. So I'm very, very optimistic or bullish or whatever you want to say on seeing the intermodal or the yard truck application. In the rails, they call them hostlers. I don't like that word. Or shunter. I don't like that one either. I like spotter or terminal truck. But that I think is where we're going to see those things really start to claw their way into the industry. But I do think you're right. I don't think we'll see major lanes get pushed out because of robots. I think humans are still going to be super important for a long time.
Trucking's like if you look, it's like an outside in adoption philosophy. I mean, how many people are still rocking glider kits so they don't have to comply with the ELD regulations?
Absolutely.
Right? So
Absolutely.
I think these things permeate from the fringe. I think this is an area, actually, if we bring this entire discussion full circle, where like, I think autonomous has a ripe, kind of fruitful hunting ground on the corners of the dusty corners of the freight industry. As you mentioned, yard work, drayage, like not complex drayage, obviously not going from like Oakland to Ontario or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And then like some of the long haul stuff. I'll be excited when I start to see not just like intra Texas, but like Dallas to Chicago 5 days a week. That's what I'll start to get excited about this as a proposition.
Yeah, I think, and it's all predicated on the regulators. So the regulators, for how they see the world, up to level 3 is all still able to be done legally in the United States for the most part. It's the level 4 and 5 when there isn't a human in there that is uncertain. And what I hope we see with the advent of more autonomous technologies is better safety performance, because I guarantee you, if you have a $1,000 a month autonomous system on a truck, you're going to maintain that. You're not going to be assuming it's going to be fine and not touch it for 6 months. You're going to be likely touching that vehicle once a week at the minimum to make sure that it is still functioning the way it's supposed to. So if we do see increase in safety, I am all for it. I do worry that once that door opens, once that barn door opens, it never goes back. And that's a real concern because for high school educated men, it's the most common job of driving a truck in the entire country, in every single state. And some of those jobs are not going to be there. I'm not as optimistic that new jobs appear when old jobs become automated. I don't think that's likely, but I could be wrong. And I'm wrong on about a lot of things.
I think two big seminal questions as you're pondering this, not just you, but your listeners, is who's going to own the technology and who's going to own the liability of autonomous?
That's right. I think you're going to find the manufacturers of autonomous stuff have been very candid by saying the motor carrier is still going to have their general liability because it's up to them to maintain it. Like they're going to have to keep general liability. But now the robotic manufacturers will have product liability. So they make the argument you'll actually have access to more insurance by having the pathway of these autonomous things. Who owns them? That'll be interesting because I think it's all going to be subscription based, and it'll be the handful of companies that survive because in this market, not a lot of people are funding projects like that. So that's a big challenge that will follow along with the market trends we're seeing.
Amen.
Well, Ken, I love having you come on. It's a pleasure to kind of dive into some of these interesting nuances. Are there any regulations that you desperately want to see or desperately don't want to see?
I mean, other than the obvious, I think like re-regulating the trucking industry or repealing the MCA or putting rate floors in again, just for obvious reasons, would be catastrophic. So I think that's a really, really bad idea. I think speed limiters will be the next big discussion around, because again, there's a weird decoupling for trucks, right? They largely collect their revenue by mile, and they're largely kind of their opportunity is the number of hours that they have. Mm-hmm. So ELDs didn't pull any trucks off the road per se. What it did was it reduced the number of legal hours they could operate, both on and off duty. So I think depending on where that speed limit is set, it will have a meaningful impact on total trucking capacity measured in hours, which will, of course, have an impact on supply and demand.
I think from a question, though, Ken, as we talk, just build off that. That's an interesting question. If we look at the whole world of trucks on the road, most of the major for hires are already regulated. Much like the ELD mandate, most of them are already using some form or fashion of an ELD. It was the smaller carriers that weren't. And that new subscription service they had to buy did push a portion of them out. I'd be really curious to understand, like, what is the capacity suck, if it is such a thing, of regulating speed at a level that is slower than what most of these trucking companies are going by. I think at scale, it is something significant. I don't know, but it'd be an interesting thing to do some research on.
Depends on where they set it, right? Like ELDs was easy because we knew the rule. We knew how they were going to change, what it means to be on and off duty at what speed. Have you ever seen like a truck slow? You have, but whenever I tell people, like they always ask me, like, why are those trucks going like 2 miles an hour to limp to an exit ramp to get to a rest area? I'm like, they're trying not to trigger their ELD. So I think like if they set it at 63, which I think would be probably on the unreasonable side of low, it's going to have a huge impact. If they set it at 68 or hell 70, it's probably going to have almost no impact, right? Yeah. So like, I think but each mile per hour, and Dean Croak on my team is much more equipped to talk about this, but like each mile per hour that it encroaches on that distribution could have really, really, really big impacts. Yeah. Because I think like a lot of the big fleets that have speed limiters, they're like very dynamic, and it like largely controls, that knows what the speed limit is, the road you're on, and it controls like in relation to that. I think what we're talking about here is like how it impacts long haul over the road, over those big stretches where you're munching along at 70, 75, and it could be the speed limit, right? That could very well be the speed limit in the big square states anyway. And you get chopped down to 63, you're losing 17 miles per hour. Literally. Right. Like we need to like we need to force our lizard brains to think this actually means miles covered per hour. And on an 11-hour shift, how many miles is that? Right. Then you can do the math.
I suspect we'll see something between 65 and 68. That's my guess. Time will tell. Now, I'm going to have you have the last word because we just got a comment here from Victoria, and I want to make sure I take care of the folks that are watching at home. So sorry, I have to do this for Ken. Finish this chant. O-H, what happens?
I-O.
Oh, there you go, man. Well,
Go
Ken,
Bucks.
Thank you so much for being here. I will tell you, I hope the Illini are victorious today. I did go to Illinois for undergrad, so I do love, and the Big Ten does well. If they end up winning, I'll make sure to send you a very friendly note. But if Michigan wins, or Ohio State wins, I will do the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, Ohio State's basketball team is terrible. They fired their coach midseason, so we're taking anything we can get. Maybe we can get into the tournament and have like a meaningful game to watch next Thursday or Friday. I'd be happy, but I'm gearing up for football this year. We're coming to your house this year, I think, right?
Oh,
We
that's
come up
exciting.
and we come up East Lansing to see Ohio State roll in, play the Spartans.
Well, if you're going, I'll go too. We'll meet up there, have some fun.
Let's do it.
All right, man. Well, thank you for joining us. I'm going to kick you off and say some goodbyes to everybody, but thank you for joining us today, Ken. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, there you go, folks. Once again, we get through another exciting episode, I hope. We had some great numbers. This is the best I think we've ever had. Thank you so much for tuning in, for joining us as we continue to talk about the things that make the world move. Trucks, trailers, brokers, and manufacturers, who we call shippers. They don't usually call themselves shippers unless they're in the transportation department. As always, thank you for tuning in. If you find this interesting, please like and subscribe to the podcast. Fleeting Conversations, I'll have this up at the podcast probably within the next couple of days. And as always, it's great to have you here. And a big shout out to our friends at DAT, because you know what? You need to find freight. And when the system's working, you can find that freight. And we are so excited to have a chance to partner with this American brand that has done enormous help for trucking companies all across America. As always, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Have a great day.